Today is July the 5th, 2020. I saw on Facebook this week where someone had questioned why the church meets on Sunday and not on Saturday, the Sabbath day. Today, July the 5th, 2020, happens to be on a Sunday. Sunday is not a Christian Sabbath. Sunday is not a Sabbath at all. It is the first day of the week. Now, to understand about the Sabbath, let's go back to the beginning. When God made everything in 6 days, He rested on the seventh day and called it a Sabbath. And why did God rest on the seventh day? Did He get tired? I don't think so. The reason He rested was to set an example for us. Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. What does that mean? That means that God knows that man needs rest. His body and his mind needs a day of rest. The Sabbath was a day of rest. God rested on the seventh day as an example that men should follow. Not that God needed to rest, because God doesn't need to rest. But He knew that men did, so He set aside one day and said, on this day, you just rest. You won't work. So all during the years, the Sabbath was a day of rest. During the time of Noah and Abraham and into Egypt and coming out, and finally at the law of Moses, God made it a commandment for the children of Israel to rest on the Sabbath day. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't even build a fire. They couldn't cook a meal. Couldn't pick up sticks. And that was part of the 10 Commandments. It amuses me when people say, oh, I keep the 10 Commandments. No, you don't. If you kept the 10 Commandments, you'd stay at home on Saturday all day long and not do a thing. But you don't do that. So don't tell me you keep the 10 Commandments, because you don't. Now then, we go down through the coming into the land and go through the period of Judges. Sabbath was a rest. We go into the period of the Kings. Sabbath was a rest. Now, about 600 years before Christ, before He came, the Jews were carried off into Babylonian captivity and were there for 70 years. During that time, they did something, they began to do something that they never done before. That is, they began to meet in what was called a synagogue. They met on the Sabbath day, I assume, because they couldn't do anything else on that day. They had to work the other days, so they met on the Sabbath day to read the Scriptures, hear someone speak, and to pray. And so the synagogue was not started by God. It was never commanded that they do that. There weren't any rabbis before this time. So the Sabbath day has always been a day of rest. They were 3 times a year, they were commanded to come to Jerusalem, Jews were, for Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. And on the feast day, it was a special Sabbath that they were not supposed to work. But there was never, ever a time where weekly God ever commanded them to meet. They did it on their own. Now, Jesus certainly met in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He did that every week. He went to the synagogue. But that was not commanded for us to do that. The Sabbath day was a day of rest, and you can be sure that Jesus rested on the Sabbath day because He completely kept the law of Moses. So now why do we meet on the first day of the week and not on the Sabbath day? Well, the early church met on the first day of the week. in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, and upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued speech until midnight. So on the first day of the week, they came together to break bread together. All right, then in 1 Corinthians 16:2, it says, upon the first day of the week, get that, first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. So it's obvious that the early church met on the first day of the week, on Sunday, and not on the Sabbath day, because the Sabbath day was a day of rest, and God never ever commanded that the Sabbath day be a day of meeting and worship. So we meet today on what we call the Lord's Day, because that was the day the Lord came forth from the dead. I hope this helps. Hope you have a great day today.